So Jordan Peterson recently interviewed Elon Musk on Twitter. A lot of people are talking about this interview because Elon sort of reveals why he actually bought Twitter in the first place, why he's supporting Trump now, and why he's sort of attacking what he calls the woke mind virus. A lot of people are talking about this interview because of that, but I actually wanted to talk about something else. It came at a point in the conversation where they were talking about antinatalism. Elon sort of started to explain where he's coming from and the philosophy that he developed as a young child. Then Jordan Peterson sort of tied that back into things that Jesus has said, and it's just super fascinating. It's kind of difficult to understand, so that's why I wanted to comment on it, to hopefully break this down for you guys so you can understand actually the genius of what Jordan was talking about and how you might actually apply it to your life.
So I'm very curious about your intuition there. Like, that's a long time ago. And so how did you cotton on to the fact that that antagonistic attitude towards birth that's embedded in our culture now was something that should be called out and that was pathological?
Well, I mean, I should perhaps go back to what is the foundation of my philosophy that I think helps build up, to explain my actions. When I was, I don't know, about 11 or 12 years old, had somewhat of an existential crisis because there just didn't seem to be any meaning in the world, no meaning to life. Mm-hmm. And so I actually tried to read all the religious texts.
At that age?
Yes.
Okay.
So I was a voracious reader as a kid. Obviously read the Bible. I read the Quran, the Torah. The various a bit on the Hindu side. Just trying to understand all these things.
I mean, say what you will about Elon and Jordan, but I mean, being interested in these things at that young of an age, actually, I think, in my opinion, is an indication that these guys that we're looking at here are very intelligent. And
obviously, as a 12-year-old, you're not really going to understand these things super well. But I've just
you understood it well enough to have an existential crisis when you were 11 or 12.
Yeah, I'm just trying to.
Well, that's a start.
Does anyone have an answer that makes sense? And then I started getting into the philosophy books, and I read quite a bit of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. And which is quite depressing to read as a kid.
Yeah, you might say that.
That's depressing as an adult, but and none of them really seemed to have answers that resonated, at least to me. And but then I read Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is really a book on philosophy disguised as humor. Mm-hmm. And what the point that Adams tries to make there is that we don't actually know all the answers, obviously.
Yeah.
In fact, we don't even know what the right questions are to ask. That's where he has, this if you've read the book, Earth is actually a giant computer to understand the answer to the question, what is the meaning of life?
Yeah.
And comes up with the answer 42.
Yeah.
And people are like, what does that mean? It says, you didn't understand the thing that's going to take a computer far more powerful than Earth is to understand what question to ask.
Yeah, right.
That's simply the wrong question.
So was that the key realization, that the question
I would say that was a fundamental turning point, yeah.
Yeah, because that's it. So that's very interesting, because one of the things that you see constantly portrayed in redemptive hero myths across the world is that the adventure is the thing and that the search is the thing, rather than there being a final answer, as absurd as 42 might be, right? There's no that the conclusive answer is something like deep engagement in the process. So I'll give you an example of that.
Okay, we're going to get into an example, but what he's pointing out here, well, Elon sort of explains that his search for meaning led him to Douglas Adams, of all people, who actually produced this really philosophical work that's embedded sort of in comedy and stuff, but it helped him see that meaning is in the sort of journey, or trying to seek and trying to find really just the questions to ask and that seeking. And so Jordan Peterson, what he does at this point is he gives an example from the Bible, which he tends to do, but then we're going to look at that example that he gives a lot more in depth because, well, it was difficult to understand at first when I first heard this. And so, again, I want to kind of help break this down and show to you guys that what he's saying here is super helpful, super insightful, and I think it could really change your life, like in a lot of ways. So let's continue. Let's listen to Jordan's response now.
So in the Sermon on the Mount's a very detailed set of instructions.
Yeah.
So there's 3 parts to it. The first is aim at the highest thing that you can possibly conceive of and keep modifying that so your aim gets better. Okay, so that's number 1. Number two is make the presumption that other people have the same intrinsic value as you do.
Well, we have to be careful about that one.
Okay, well, let's discuss that. But it's a, what would you say? It's a recognition of the universalist value of everyone who's made in the image of God. It's something like that. But the third thing is, once you do those two things, you can concentrate on the moment. See, and that seems to be, even technically, you can think about this neuropsychologically.
So he's about to explain sort of the neuroscience, and like he's going to talk about dopamine, entropy, and stuff, and it gets really complex. But what I want to do at first is just kind of go through the Sermon on the Mount and sort of test his claim here. He says that it breaks down into 3 different categories, right? He says that it's, well, first, you want to aim for the best thing that you can imagine and sort of keep getting better at it. And then second, you want to remember that everyone else is just as important or valuable as you are. And then third, he says, when you do these 2 things, you can focus on what's happening sort of right now and kind of helps you overcome your anxiety. And so that's what he says that the Sermon on the Mount is all about. Now, the language that he uses, that it comes in 3 different parts, which I think is sort of the wrong way to interpret Jordan here. Jordan doesn't really speak in language that a lot of us are used to talking in. And so anyways, let's get to the Sermon on the Mount. This is it. So Sermon on the Mount actually happens in Matthew 5 through 7. So I'm just going to kind of go through here and show you guys that I think this actually does line up if we think about sort of Jordan coming up with a kind of rational reconstruction of what the overall points are of the Sermon on the Mount. So I'm just going to go through some examples here. So at the first, the Beatitudes, you get blessed are, various people who are expressing these moral virtues. But I'm going to go through some of the very obvious, I think, examples of Jordan Peterson's first point, which again is sort of aim for the best thing that you can imagine and sort of keep getting better at it. And so I think this is sort of the overall point almost of the entire Sermon on the Mount. But here's one example when it comes to anger. You have heard that it was said of those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. So he's talking about something that they've heard that they need to now improve on. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says you fool will be liable to the hell of fire. And so again, this is sort of calling us to an even greater moral standard. When it comes to lust, here you go. You have heard that it was said, this is something that this was a sort of moral precept at the time, you shall not commit adultery. And then he says, let's take it a step further. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Here's another example. Again, taking it one step further, divorce. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of sexual immorality makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, taking it a step further, calling us to a higher level. Retaliation. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other cheek also. Loving your enemies. It goes on and on and on. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Now, this one actually also supports his second contention, which is that this is one of the sort of rational components of the Sermon on the Mount is that you want to remember that everyone else is just as important or valuable as you are. So you want to turn your cheeks because these people are valuable. And then here's another sort of example of this in the same passage, verse 46. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even Gentiles do the same? You therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Now let's continue here. He also gives an example of prayer. This is the famous sort of Lord's Prayer passage in Matthew 6. Now this, I think, again shows that we're trying to strive higher. We're trying to attain these higher and higher goods. And so he says, when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites. And then he says, but when you pray, go into your room, shut the door, and pray to your Father who is in secret. So he's again calling us to these higher goods. Now, let's now go down and talk about the anxiety passage, which starts at Matthew 6:25, and it goes all the way down to 34, down here that you guys can see. The important part here is that what he says, what Jordan Peterson's point here, though, is that once you do these first 2 things, when you aim for the best thing you can imagine, keep getting better at it, the greatest good, and then secondly, when you remember that everyone else is just as important and valuable as you are, then at that point, you can focus on sort of what's happening right now, which is actually sort of a cognitive behavioral therapy way of dealing with anxiety, is that instead of worrying about tomorrow, you focus on what's happening right in front of you. And so that's what he says. Once you do those other two things, then you can start to get to that point of being able to focus on the now. And here's what this verse says. So 6:33, but seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all of these things will be added to you. And again, the context here is talking about reducing anxiety. And so that's directly in line with what he says. When you do these other two things, this is what Jordan says, when you do these two things, like trying to get better, trying to be more holy, trying to live more virtuously, then you can start to really overcome your anxiety. That alone is mind-blowing, and you guys need to be, like clapping on your own in your, wherever you're watching this. That is, a lot of people deal with anxiety, me included, and just the fact that you can reduce your anxiety by focusing on being a virtuous person, that alone is worth everything that you're going to get out of this video. But then it goes on, therefore, do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. Because in chapter 7, it goes on and it gives you some more examples of the other two that we've already looked at, striving for these higher goods, showing that other people are intrinsically valuable. So in chapter 7, the golden rule pops up. So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do to them, for this is the law. For this is the law and the prophets. And so all of this is sort of the rational structure of it is that we're trying to attain these goods that we thought were good initially, and then Jesus calls us to be higher, to grow, and even be more righteous and more holy. And I mean that's kind of daunting almost. It's like how do we do that? Why should we even try to do that? Is it possible? And so then what Jordan does is he explains from a neurological standpoint and a psychological standpoint, hey, that's actually like it lines up with the way that our brains are actually set up. And so let's continue now the clip from Jordan and get the next thing that he says here, where he sort of expands on what he just said.
So if you're looking for meaning is a form of incentive reward. And incentive reward is dopaminergically mediated. And incentive reward occurs in relationship to advancement towards a goal, which is a form of entropy minimization, as it turns out, according to Carl Friston, who knows this sort of thing.
Entropy is the ultimate boss battle.
Yeah, right. Well, negative emotion signifies the emergence of entropy, and positive emotion on the dopaminergic side signals its reduction. But there's something that's more complex there, because the higher the goal that you're trying to attain, the more intrinsic value each step towards it comprises, and that's neuropsychologically accurate. And so part of the wisdom of the Sermon on the Mount is that if you posit the highest imaginable goal, then any step towards it that captures your attention is also deeply meaningful. And so that's an answer to what the meaning is of process, rather than, say, something like 42. And you said, it seems to me that you were intimating that your discovery through Adams, that the question was the thing, was key to the resolution of your existential crisis.
That's correct.
Okay, so that's part of the reason that you're motivated to, say, build Grok 3 and look deeper.
To understand.
So this section was a lot more difficult, I think, to understand and follow, especially if you're not super familiar with terms like dopamine and even entropy and maximizing, minimizing entropy. Those can kind of get confusing if you're not familiar with all that jargon and stuff. But basically what he's saying is that when you work toward a goal, your brain gives you rewards, like dopamine, sort of as you get closer to that goal. And this is because making progress helps bring order to your life, which is what entropy minimization means. You're trying to reduce chaos. And so when you feel bad, it means that things are getting more chaotic and messy in your life. And when you feel good, it means things are becoming more orderly and you're making progress. But then he says that there's more to it. The bigger and more important your goal is, the more meaningful each step towards it feels. And this is something that brain science apparently supports. Your brain values each small step toward a bigger goal more than it does toward a smaller goal. Okay, so the idea is that in the Sermon on the Mount, we've got these really great goods that we're trying to strive toward. And Jesus is calling us to even higher standards, which Jordan is pointing out that actually that lines up with neuroscience. Okay, when you strive for an even greater goal, smaller steps toward that goal actually give you a sort of a higher boost of dopamine, gives you more incentive, more motivation to do it. So you're actually, the reward centers in your brain are actually lighting up even more when you're doing this. And so while it seems like this is, Jesus, why are you calling us to these such high standards? Well, actually it makes a lot of sense from a psychological standpoint. And it also lines up exactly with Elon's sort of philosophical underpinnings and where he's coming from and all of that. So brilliant point to make actually by Jordan on this. Now, I actually wanted to talk about another clip in which Jordan and Elon were talking about something else earlier on, just a couple minutes before, but it relates to belief in God and purpose and what happens if we remove God from the picture, what happens at that point. So let's watch this clip.
Okay, so imagine this. Imagine that there's a unity of moral purpose that is conceptualized in the traditional writings as what should be put in the highest place. So it's God, and in the final analysis, it's ineffable. But it is a fundamental unification, of monotheism. Okay, now, here's a hypothesis. When that collapses, two things arise to replace it. Okay, one is the striving for power, and the other is the untrammeled, what would you call it? The untrammeled dominion of hedonism, and especially on the sexual gratification side.
Okay, so when belief in God goes away, as the source of one's moral purpose, two things sort of rise to replace it, either the striving for power or the striving for hedonic pleasure.
So it's like if there's no ultimate unity that's future and community oriented, that's predicated on sacrifice, you get a dissolution immediately into the next two contenders for domination. And one is, it's about me, buddy, and get the hell out of the way. And aligned with that is, not only is it about me, it's about me, what would you say, subjugated to my most base whims, because why would I want power except to do exactly what the hell I want whenever I want to?
Quick paraphrase of this. So when people stop believing in God as their reason for doing good things, they usually turn to either trying to become very powerful or just want to enjoy themselves like as much as possible. And I think one big reason to think that this is true is that when people don't have a higher purpose or a set of moral guidelines, they just feel sort of lost or unsure about what's most important in life. And this actually, I think, goes in line with what Jordan was talking about later on in the interview when he's talking about the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus calling us to higher standards. So, and without this guidance, they might turn to things like power or pleasure to fill that gap, because there's sort of easy and immediate ways of feeling important or happy. I mean, what do you guys think about this? What happens in your lives? And I want you guys to think about this on your own. When you have not put God first, where do you find yourself going? What are you putting your emphasis on? Where do you find that where do your motivations go? Is it toward something virtuous, or is it towards something either related to power or pleasure? Let me know in the comments. What do you guys think about all this?